Academic assessments, ensuring that they are learning. The scripture that I've chosen for this workshop, you might think is kind of an odd place to take from the scripture to talk about academic assessments. Lamentations chapter 3 and verse 40, the first part of the verse says, "Let us search and try our ways." I'll explain to you in a moment why I chose that verse, but maybe I was thinking about students taking academic assessments and they were having lamentations over that. But assessments are an integral part of educational instruction. Educational assessment is the process of documenting, usually in measurable terms, knowledge and skills. Assessments are a tool or method for obtaining information, usually from tests of some kind, but also from other sources, about the achievement and the abilities of students. For us as educators, it is healthy and profitable for us to look at what we're doing on a regular basis to make sure that our students are in fact learning what they're supposed to be learning. Hence the verse from Lamentations, "Let us search and try our ways." However, we as educators also must remember that we are they who must give an account someday to the Lord for everything that we have said and done in our learning centers. Now, I don't think He's going to ask for achievement test scores when we do that, but it's good for us to know that we're doing what we're supposed to be doing before we have to give that account to the Lord. So let's look at actually two types of assessments that are familiar. The first one, obviously, is a PACE test that you're very familiar with. Most of the tests taken in the Learning Center are what are called instructional tests. And instructional tests are tailored to the individual needs of the student. In the Learning Center, they just finished that PACE. They handed in that PACE, and they're going to take the PACE test on it. The PACE test provides you, the supervisor, with immediate feedback on a student's mastery of that particular subject area. An instructional test usually covers a relatively small unit of content, in this case, a single PACE, and the scores on a PACE test or an instructional test have meaning in what terms of what a student knows and can do. And then the score has meaning usually when there's a minimum score set. If the student scores above that minimum score, they're considered to have mastered the material. So for a PACE test, that's obviously 80%. I talked about instructional tests just by way of comparison. We're going to spend most of our time in the workshop talking about achievement tests. Achievement tests measure progress. An achievement test monitors growth over time, or growth being defined as a change in student achievement. With an achievement test, it is possible to monitor growth over time, providing convincing evidence of improvement by following the progress of students from year to year. The results of an achievement test give you as an educator an objective image of student progress due to a consistency of format, content, and administrative procedure. It's an objective image of each student because no one on your staff wrote the test. It's objective because no one on your staff scored the test. It's an outside entity, an outside organization that created the test and scored the test, so it's an objective image of your student's progress. An achievement test, in most cases, is administered one time during the school year, so it provides a snapshot of a student's strengths and needs. Unlike a PACE test, an achievement test is not a mastery test, but an achievement test determines what a student knows at a specific time. And an achievement test will show if a student is doing better in some subjects than in others, and whether a student is improving in certain areas from year to year. I assume by now you all know that A.C.E. now offers the Iowa assessment and the cognitive abilities test, also known as the COGAT. Both of these tests are proven measures of student achievement and reasoning abilities built on more than 80 years of research and development. Before I continue, I want to make one point here, and that we're going to be talking about the Iowa assessments in just a moment here, and that is an achievement test. You hear a lot about test scores in the media. I want you to understand that an achievement test, its only purpose is to measure the progress of students. An achievement test cannot and should not be used to validate a curriculum or validate a school system or validate a school or validate a teacher's ability. Now, when we hear about test scores in the media, they're talking about a variety of different kinds of tests, but an achievement test, its sole purpose, primary purpose, is to measure progress in students academically. So, what are the Iowa assessments? The Iowa assessments are a standardized, norm-referenced achievement test, yielding accurate and objective scores. It is a standardized test. A standardized test is a test that is administered and scored under uniform or standardized conditions. It is a standardized norm-referenced test. A norm-referenced test is a standardized test designed to measure how a student's performance compares to the performance of a reference group or norming group who has previously taken the same test at about the same time in the school year. When an achievement test is developed, the test is written and then it is administered to a large, very diverse group of students, diverse in just about every way you can think of, geographically, urban, country schools, private schools, parochial schools, public schools, diverse ethnically and racially. And then all those tests are scored, and the students who scored in the middle on that test become the 50th percentile in the norm. So all of your students, when they take that test, will be compared to how those students who took that original test. That is what a norm reference test is. So the Iowa assessments are a standardized norm referenced achievement test. An achievement test is a test typically standardized and norm referenced, intended to measure a student's progress in basic subjects such as reading, mathematics, language, science, and social studies. So, the Iowa assessments are a standardized norm-referenced achievement test. For purposes of comparison, the Stanford 10 was a standardized norm-referenced achievement test. What is the COGAT, or the Cognitive Abilities Test? It is a standardized norm-referenced abilities test, yielding accurate and objective scores. Again, it is standardized, administered and scored under uniform or standardized conditions. Again, the COGAT is also a norm reference test where your students' progress or performance is compared to the performance of that norming group who previously has taken the test at about the same time during the school year. But the COGAT is a standardized norm-referenced abilities test. It is not an IQ test. It is a test intended, the COGAT, Cognitive Abilities Test, is a test to measure students' learned reasoning and problem-solving abilities through three kinds of tests. The COGAT consists of a verbal battery, a quantitative battery, and a nonverbal battery. The verbal battery of the COGAT attests your students' ability to make meaning through or based on information given. Usually that is done by they read a text. The older the student, the longer the text, but then they answer questions based on what they just read. The quantitative battery of the COGAT is the mathematical part, and that tests your students' ability to use patterns and relations being mathematical equations. And then the nonverbal battery tests your students to their ability to use diagrams for expressing ideas instead of numbers or words. So, the COGAT is a standardized norm-referenced abilities test. For purposes of comparison, the OSAT 8 was a standardized norm-referenced abilities test. Why use the Iowa assessments? The paper and pencil version of the Stanford 10 was last updated in 2002, and the online version of the Stanford 10 was last updated in 2007. It is standard practice to update a nationally normed achievement and abilities test approximately every 10 years. So you can see the paper and pencil version of the Stanford 10 was 14 years old, and the online version was just at that 10-year-old mark. Pearson, who was the publisher of the Stanford 10, indicated to all the people, and there were quite a few people, that used the Stanford 10 that they would not be updating the Stanford 10 test. In April of 2014, Pearson announced that they would stop supporting the Stanford 10 after 2016, and they would retire the test. All the people that used the Stanford 10 and the OSAT 8 had no control over that. That was just announced to us as a fait accompli that they were going to retire the test. Now, A.C.E. had a very mutually beneficial relationship with Pearson and the Stanford 10 for many, many years, probably 15 or 16 years. But they said they were going to retire the test. Now, Pearson, since they announced that, they told us after June 30th, 2016, the Stanford 10 would no longer be available. So everybody who used the Stanford 10 and the OSAT 8 had to find a replacement. But since they made that announcement, since Pearson made that announcement, they changed their mind, and they decided to continue publishing the Stanford 10. However, they still weren't going to update it. So those norms were going to get farther and farther out of date. I have my personal opinions why they decided to continue publishing, but I'm not going to share my personal opinions with you. Everybody who used the Stanford 10 had to find a replacement. Mrs. Howard tasked me. She gave us 2 tests to look at and to make a recommendation for the replacement for the Stanford 10. So Mrs. Gilby and I read every page of every test booklet of every level of 2 national achievement tests. We know more about those 2 tests than we frankly ever cared to know. But we recommended, when we said to Mrs. Howard that either one would serve our needs, but our recommendation was to Mrs. Howard that the Iowa assessments would be our recommendation. The Iowa assessments have a 2011 norm, so they're right in the middle of that 10-year norming cycle. Now, no national assessment is Christian because they're all published by secular publishers. However, in our opinion, the most neutral assessment was clearly the Iowa. Now, Iowa has 3 forms of their test, 3 batteries of their test, if you will. One of those batteries is aligned with the Common Core standards. But if you've been seeing in the news that in many parts of the country, the Common Core standards are gasping for breath and dying a slow and painful death, and that's fine with me. That is a personal opinion. But Iowa also has what they call the complete battery of the Iowa assessments, and that is the form of the test that we are offering to you. The complete battery of the Iowa is not, got the word not aligned with the Common Core standards. However, you may be interested to know that the academic standards that the Common Core standards were trying to achieve, the complete battery of the Iowa met those academic standards before the Common Core standards were ever written. So the test we are offering to you, the complete battery of the Iowa assessments, is not or are not aligned with the Common Core standards. The cornerstone of the Iowa assessments has always been its strong research base, and they've been around for over 80 years. I remember as an elementary school student, it was called the Iowa Test of Basic Skills back then, an ancestor of the Iowa assessments today, but they have lots of experience. That research that forms the basis of the Iowa is academic research done, surprise, surprise, at the University of Iowa. So it's a very sound academic assessment. So what are the benefits of using the Iowa assessments? Well, I already told you that it monitors growth using a continuous research-based vertical scale to accurately measure academic growth from kindergarten through high school. It's a vertical scale, so if you have a student who learns to read in your school, ABC student, and they graduate from your school, you can measure their progress from year to year to year to year to year using the Iowa assessments. The Iowa assessment also engages students. It is an attractive 4-color design, and I think it was more attractive than the other alternative that we looked at. That's important because if it's pleasing to the students' eyes, they like it, and they will hopefully do better on the test. The Iowa assessment offers a choice of administration options that includes both a paper and pencil version and an online version. And you have a choice. Now, it's entirely up to you which one you use. You can do all paper and pencil. You can do all online from 4th grade through 12th grade, or you can do a combination of the two. There are some schools, for example, that are going to use the paper and pencil version, say for the first 5 or 6 levels, and they're going to have their high school or junior high school students do the online version, and that is fine. It's entirely up to you which one you want to use. So that's the benefits of using the IO. What are the benefits of using the COGAT? The cognitive abilities test, similar to what we did with the OSAT 8, there is a cognitive abilities test available for every level of the IO assessments, but we are offering to you level or grades 2, 5, and 8 of the COGAT. A couple of reasons: expense, keep the expense down for you as a local school, and secondly, a student's ability does not change significantly from one year to the next. So we have 3 benchmarks there where you can measure the student's ability. As I said, the COGAT measures a student's verbal, quantitative, and nonverbal reasoning ability. And when the COGAT and the IO assessments are administered at the same time, it delivers predictive data that highlights significant discrepancies between expected and actual achievement. Let me explain what I mean. When the 2 tests are taken together, if a student scores here on the COGAT, this is a test of their ability, and they take the IO assessments and their achievement is here, that means that child is not performing up to their ability. So you as the supervisor then know that you can put some more pressure on that student. You can increase the goals, give them more subjects, whatever it is you want to do, because you know they're not performing up to their ability. Flip side, if a student takes the COGAT and they score here, and they take the IO assessments and their achievement is here, then you know they're performing pretty much as best they can, so you would know not to put more pressure on that student because they're performing pretty much as the best that they can. And again, there's flexibility of administration with the COGAT, again, available both in paper and pencil and online. Something else you may find interesting, the COGAT measures a broad range of student performance. So the COGAT is written in such a way that there are easier questions, medium difficulty questions, and difficult questions all on every level of the test when it is administered, so that it is easier. Now, this is not the reason they wrote the test that way, but a benefit for us is you can get an accurate measure of a student's ability even when you test them at their chronological grade level if their performance level is not up to their chronological grade level, which reduces the need for us testing out of chronological grade level. I will come back to that question in a moment because I know many A.C.E. educators, it ruffles their feathers when we tell them you need to do an achievement test at chronological grade level regardless of what the student's performance level is. But on the COGAT, there's less need for that because they have a wide range of difficulty questions on the test. The COGAT is also English Language Learner Friendly, ELL, English Language Learner Friendly. That means that historically on an abilities test, a student whose first language was not English, often the test, if they took an abilities test, the test was not an accurate reflection of their ability because there would be sometimes cultural nuances in that abilities test that a child whose first language wasn't English wouldn't understand. The COGAT was written with that in mind. As much as possible, they removed those cultural nuances so that even a child whose first language is not English, when they take the COGAT, it is an accurate measure of their ability. And then I already said that it gives you flexibility in administration, both paper and pencil or online. Now, it said you can do either paper and pencil or online, but there are some significant advantages to using the online administration of both the IO assessments and the cognitive abilities test. Now, the online version of the IO assessments is only available grade 4 through 12. The younger students always take paper and pencil. If you use the online version, of the Iowa assessments. There's no physical commitment on the school's part to order, store, or ship booklets and answer documents. So you don't have to have all the paper, the test booklets and the answer documents in your school if you use the online version. If you use the online version, you get your results much more quickly. You've done achievement testing before. You know, after the students take the test, you have to package the test in a prescribed way, grouping them the way that you've grouped your students. You put them in a box, you ship them to the publisher of the test, they score the test, and they send you back answer documents. That takes quite a bit of time, sometimes several weeks. Now, as a parenthetical statement, in our working with Iowa, a team from A.C.E. visited Riverside Publishing, who was the publisher of the Iowa assessments, and Riverside Publishing is a division of Houghton, Mifflin, and Harcourt. They've been publishing textbooks for generations. But we went to their scoring facility, and the Pentagon should have security procedures as tight as the scoring facility did. But it was very impressive at how organized and how fast they do score those tests. Cut the spines off the answer documents, and they feed them through a machine at a very high rate of speed, and it reads the carbon from the number 2 pencils, and then they show us how they print the reports and all. Well, all that is wonderful, but it takes time. But if you use the online version of the test, you can get your scores in days instead of weeks. So that's an advantage. If you use the online version, you have flexible administration options. You can do an individual student, a small group, or a large group, depending upon the number of computers that you have available. But then the rest of your students can continue to work on their pacework. And there are built-in safeguards to protect the integrity of the testing process and ensure the validity of the scores. For you as the school, and of course for the publisher of the test, they're very concerned about maintaining and protecting the integrity of a standardized test. Those who've been around a long time may remember that A.C.E. used to use the California Achievement Test for many years. But several years ago, the integrity of the California Achievement Test was compromised. And the California Achievement Test was then quarantined by several states, which those state school systems said nobody but the public schools could use the California Achievement Test, which is why we went to the Stanford 10 at that time. So there have been safeguards built into the online version to protect the integrity of the test. Secure browsers, for example. You will load a secure browser onto your computers in your school for the testing so that students can't open any other browsers or any other websites while they're taking the Iowa assessments. We don't want them going out on the internet and trying to find answers for the Iowa assessments. There's a session expiration. If a student doesn't do anything on the test for several minutes, it'll lock them out. Similar to your online banking, if you don't do something for a long time, it's going to lock you out and you have to log back in. So and secure logins, both for the test administrator and for the student. And then another thing that is available from the Iowa, with the Iowa assessment is what they call Data Manager. Data Manager is the online platform for managing the assessment program, interpreting results, and reporting scores. All the data for your students is housed on secure browsers at Riverside Publishing in Chicago. And that data, you can access that data for longitudinal tracking and reports. That's that vertical scale I mentioned earlier. Now, the 6 common reports can all be printed at your school, but you also have the option to print some other, you have some flexibility in generating other kinds of reports. And then Data Manager has an immense number of resources available to you. Helps you prepare for test events, administer the assessments, and interpret scores. However, one significant difference with the Iowa assessments is Riverside Publishing, again, the publisher of the Iowa, will not provide any reports. Whether you take paper and pencil or the online version of the test, they're not going to mail you any reports. All your reports will be printed. You will print them at your school. You have the ability to print them at your school. Now, A.C.E. has set parameters as to what reports will be available, but then you can choose which reports you want to print. You don't have to print them all if you don't want to. Cuts down on cost, paper, and overweight student permanent files, where you have a whole bunch of paper that you don't need. If a school if a school does not have the ability to print the score reports for their school themselves, then A.C.E. will print them and mail them to the school for a modest charge for printing and mailing. Also, via the data manager, you can have access to what are called college readiness scores, that when a student, beginning at the 6th grade, when a student takes the Iowa assessments, this college readiness score will predict how a student may score on the A.C.T. and the S.A.T. And when I say S.A.T., I mean the college boards, the Scholastic Aptitude Test. Now, this is a tool that you can use as a school to help counsel students and their parents about whether they're going to be college bound or not. Now, these aren't perfect, and they're just a tool. You're going to use all kinds of other things to make that decision or help parents make that decision, but you can get those college readiness scores as well. How do you use the Iowa assessments? Well, you want to make sure you prepare properly. How do you prepare for a standardized, norm-referenced, nationally recognized achievement test? Continue doing what you've been doing in your learning centers. Carefully follow learning center procedures like proper scoring, quizzing before checkups and self-tests, requiring the completion of all activities in the PACE, including those activities that teach critical thinking skills. Those are the ones they don't want to do because they're hard and they have to think. But what is the COGAT going to test? It's going to test their problem-solving ability. So you want them to do those critical thinking skills activity. And then you make sure that each student truly masters and understands all the concepts in each PACE. If they get a 79%, you have them repeat the PACE. You don't give them a point because they spelled their name right, so they can pass the test. You make sure they master all the materials. Then in the Learning Center, you apply solid academics. Giving students every benefit of all that our curriculum has to offer is the very best preparation for any kind of standardized test. Use Readmaster, Math Builder, and Word Builder regularly, and emphasize general test-taking skills, such as, what a novel idea, paying attention to all the directions, recording answers neatly. If I can't read it, it's wrong, and using the available time wisely to complete all required tasks. And then you want to administer, when you do your Iowa assessments, you want to administer the test properly. This is very important. One of the things is you want to communicate to your parents before you administer the test the importance of a good night's sleep the night before the testing day and a good breakfast on testing. That's a good thing to communicate to parents anyway, but especially on your when you're going to administer your achievement test. But for standardized tests, the way the test is administered is as important as all the other guidelines required to produce valid and reliable scores. Following appropriate and required administration practices satisfies widely accepted ethical standards and codes for the administering the test. Now, being ethical about how we administer the test should not be a question for us as Christian educators, because that's a part of our testimony. But the point is, in your learning center, you want to repeat as closely as possible the conditions under which that test was administered initially, because that's a standardized test. One thing you want to do is make sure you assign the correct test level. I told you I was going to come back to this. The Iowa is based on chronological grade level and should be administered to students according to their chronological grade level at the time of testing. And then be sure that the proper test is ordered and given to each student. If, for example, if you did a fall test, and then you're going to use the fall testing window, and then you're going to use the spring testing window, you don't give the student the same level test in the spring that you did in the fall, because there's a year's difference of education between those tests. And then you want to make sure you give them, as I said, the test based on chronological grade level. Now, we assign curriculum based on the results of diagnostic tests at the time of enrollment, and that performance level may or may not be the student's chronological grade level. Many times it is not. But the assessment assigned, the Iowa assessment assigned, should be their chronological grade level whenever possible. We do have a little bit of latitude. You can go one grade level below the chronological grade level if their performance level is significantly different from the chronological grade level, but no more than that. And here's the reason why. If you have an 8th level student whose performance level is the 4th level, and you give them a 4th level or 4th grade Iowa assessments, that test is going to be scored with all the other 8th graders, which means the scores you receive would be worthless. They wouldn't be able to tell you anything. So as much as it ruffles our feathers, we need to stay as close as possible to the student's chronological grade level. Now, if you have, as many of you do, special needs students and learning limited students, whether you administer the online version or the paper and pencil version, when you process the test, when you mail them back if they're paper and pencil, you send in the test on the online version, is a way that you can indicate that those are tests for special needs or learning limited students. You'll get scores for those students, but they won't be included in your group reports, like your Learning Center reports, so that those learning limited students' scores don't skew your Learning Center or group reports. You want to schedule your test days carefully. Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday are the best days for testing. You don't want to schedule a test Monday or Friday. You don't want to schedule your testing time right after a break. You don't want to schedule your testing, your Iowa testing, when there's something else going on in your school. You want to choose your room and staff carefully. The room where the Iowa is administered is important. Now, in many cases, you're going to use your Learning Center, which is good. But because if you have any number of groups of students you're going to test, you want to, the other rooms that you're going to use, you want those rooms to be familiar to the students. Now, for most of our schools, that's not a problem because they're in the building all the time anyway. But when the child is familiar with the room, then they're more comfortable, their comfort level is increased, and they'll do better on the test. The same way with the staff. Now, when you use your monitors and your supervisors as test administrators, of course, the children know them. But if you have any number of groups and you have to enlist the help of other people, the church secretary, the school secretary, maybe a couple of the moms, you want those adults to be familiar to the children as well, because again, it increases their comfort level and the children will do better. You want to prepare for the test day, especially if you are doing paper and pencil. You want to order all your testing materials well in advance of when you plan on doing the test, and then you want to inventory those materials when they arrive to make sure you have everything you need, and then you store those testing materials in a secure place. Don't wait until the day of the test to inventory them, because if you don't have if you're missing something, it's too late to do anything about it. When the test is administered, you want to put a do not disturb sign on the door of any rooms that you're using for testing. Your students should be seated so that they cannot see the work of other students. If they're in offices, that's obviously going to accomplish that. But if you're doing online and your computers are on computer desks, or you're doing paper and pencil and they're at tables, you want to make sure that one child can see what another child is doing. If they're doing paper and pencil, you want to make sure they have enough room for their test booklet and their answer document without having to move them around. If they have to shift the two documents around, that increases the chance of them putting an answer in the wrong place on the answer sheet. In the Learning Center, if you're using the Learning Center, you want to take down or cover any materials that may be of benefit on the test. Multiplication tables, historical timelines, maps, those kinds of things. Cover them up or take them down. You want a student taking the test going, oh, okay, that's what, cover those up or take them down. Then you want to ensure uniform procedures. Standardization, as I said, establishes uniform procedures for using the test so that every facet and condition of taking the test will be the same for every student to whom is it administered. So you want to, again, repeat or replicate the testing conditions of that norming group as closely as possible, including the directions for administration. When the test is administered to your students, the conditions under which the test was normed should be repeated as closely as possible. So your test administrators need to become familiar with those directions for administration. So you might want to let them look at those maybe the day before so that they can become familiar with what they're going to read. Now, usually in those directions for administration, what the administrator reads is usually in bold type in a different color, but make sure they understand that they're familiar with those. And those conditions that were the original norming group was tested under includes the timing of the test. That you need to stick closely to the timing of the test, because if you go beyond the allocated time for the test, that will make your score less accurate, less valid, and the scores could even be called into question. Whoever is administering the test needs to read those directions exactly as written, using a natural, deliberate tone of voice and enunciating clearly. I did the California Achievement Test, I felt like 900 gazillion times, and I could practically recite the directions for administration for the CAT from memory. You don't want to do that. The test administrator needs to read every word, enunciating clearly of all those directions of administration. And then you want to proctor the test carefully, either one, online or paper and pencil. So you have the test administrator, and then you want other people, and you may need a couple or three, depending how many students you're testing at one time, who are going to make sure the students are following directions, they're working on the correct test. If it's paper and pencil or online. They're marking their answers correctly. We don't want Christmas trees or zigzags. They're just filling in circles as they go along, that they're actually answering the questions properly. Encourage them to answer all the questions and finish the test, because the Iowa has what is known as attemptedness rules, which means a student has to answer a minimum number of questions on the test in order to get a score. And then if you're using paper and pencil, you want to carefully check and pack your completed tests according to directions before you ship them to Riverside for scoring. Now, you have an immense number of resources available to you, because for many of you it's going to be the first time you've administered the Iowa and or the COGAT. Now, we did have a fall testing window for our schools with the Iowa assessments and the COGAT. Not a great number of schools, not nearly as many as we used the spring testing window, but the feedback we got from those schools was very positive. They were pleased with the test and so forth. You can go to our website. There's a link on the left side of the page for assessments. There are step-by-step instructions on exactly what you need to do. There are tutorial videos available for you to walk you through visually the steps you need to take. And then several of our customer service representatives have been specifically trained to assist you with questions for the Iowa assessment. So if you call and you need to identify the fact that you have questions about the Iowa assessments, and then you will be routed to one of those customer service representatives that can help you with that.